She arrived in Texas with a split lip, a name she was ashamed of, and a suitcase held shut with a leather belt because the clasp had been broken for 2 years and she'd never been allowed to replace it. The man who'd owned her life for the past 4 years was still out there, boss, rich, connected, and patient the way only truly dangerous men could afford to be. And she was about to walk up to a stranger's door and call herself his bride. If you've ever had to choose between one kind of cage and the open unknown, you'll understand why Lydia Ashcroft's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Stay with me until the end. Like this video, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. The stagecoach dropped her at the edge of a town that barely deserved the name. Tallow Creek, Texas. Population: enough people to fill a church, and not enough to fill it comfortably. The main street was packed dirt and horse dung, and the particular kind of silence that settles over places that have given up trying to impress anyone. There was a feed store with a crooked sign, a saloon with a broken shutter banging in the wind, a post office that doubled as a telegraph office that doubled, according to the hand-lettered notice on the door, as a notary public on Tuesdays. Lydia Ashcroft stepped down from the coach and immediately felt the stares. She was used to stares. In Philadelphia, people had stared because of the way she dressed, always a little too worn at the hem, always a little too careful about which side of her face she turned toward the light. Here they stared because she was new, and new things in Tallow Creek were apparently worth examining like a specimen in a jar. She was 24 years old. She had dark hair that she'd pinned up that morning with more care than she'd given anything in recent memory, and brown eyes that people sometimes called warm until they looked closely enough to see that she'd learned to keep the real thing locked somewhere a long way back. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped men in the street, but she had the kind of face that made people think they recognized her from somewhere, that they'd seen her before, that she was familiar, and she'd learned that familiarity made people feel they had a claim on you, so she'd also learned to hold herself slightly apart, slightly remote, like a door that opened inward only. The letter from Rowan Hale had been 43 words long. She'd counted, twice. Miss Ashcroft, I have a working ranch 12 miles east of Tallow Creek. I need a capable woman willing to build something real. I cannot promise comfort. I can promise honest work and honest dealing. If that suits you, I'll be at the station the first Friday of March. R. Hale. 43 words. No mention of love. No flowery promises. No description of himself beyond the word honest, which could mean anything, and usually meant nothing. She had answered the advertisement through the matrimonial bureau out of pure desperation, and she had told herself every day of the 3-week journey that she was making a terrible mistake, and she had come anyway because the alternative was staying in Philadelphia, and staying in Philadelphia meant Voss. She was not going to think about Voss. Not today. She picked up her suitcase, the one held shut with the belt, and looked up and down the street. A man was leaning against the post of the feed store with his arms crossed, watching her. He wasn't watching her the way some of the others were, with that undisguised frontier curiosity that didn't even try to pretend it was something else. He was watching her the way you watched a storm on the horizon, carefully, measuring it, trying to decide what it was going to do. He was taller than she'd expected, though she didn't know why she'd expected anything. Lean through the shoulders, but not slight. The kind of build that came from actual work, not from trying to look like you did actual work. His hair was dark and needed cutting. He had a jaw that looked like it had strong opinions, and a mouth that looked like it kept most of them to itself. He was probably 30, maybe a little past it. He had a scar along the left side of his chin that had healed badly, and he hadn't shaved that morning, or possibly the morning before that. He wasn't handsome. He wasn't ugly. He was a man standing in front of a feed store in a town in Texas, and the only remarkable thing about him at first was the stillness. He didn't fidget, he didn't shift his weight, he just stood there and waited, like a man who had learned that most things came to you if you were patient enough, and that the things that didn't weren't worth chasing. He pushed off the post when she looked at him and crossed the street. His boots were dusty. His coat had been mended at the right elbow. He stopped 3 feet away from her, which was farther away than most men would have stopped, and he tilted his chin slightly in what might have been a greeting. Miss Ashcroft. It wasn't a question. He'd apparently already decided. Mr. Hale, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Not the way men looked at her when they were deciding whether she was worth something, but the way a person looked at another person when they were trying to understand something complicated. Then he looked at the suitcase. "Is that all you brought?" "Yes." He nodded, like that told him something. Maybe it did. "Wagon's on the south end of the street," he said. "I need to pick up supplies at the feed store first. Won't take more than 20 minutes. You can wait in the wagon if you want, or you can come in. Up to you." Up to you. She hadn't heard those 3 words together in that order directed at her in a very long time, and the effect was strange, like being offered a door you'd forgotten existed. "I'll come in," she said. He picked up her suitcase before she could reach for it. Not gallantly, not with any ceremony, just picked it up because it was there, and he was walking in that direction anyway. The leather belt held. She was grateful for small things. The feed store smelled like grain dust and something vaguely animal. The man behind the counter was built like a barrel and had a mustache that appeared to be making its own architectural decisions. He looked at Lydia with undisguised interest and then looked at Rowan. "This her?" "Yes," Rowan said. "She looks—" The man started. "I'm right here," Lydia said, quietly but clearly. The man blinked. Then, somewhat to her surprise, he grinned. "Fair enough. I'm Deacon Pryor. I run this place. You need anything in town, you come to me first." "Thank you," she said, and meant it about 40%. Rowan placed his order, oats, nails, a coil of rope, a tin of axle grease, with the economy of a man who had done this many times and saw no reason to embellish it. While Pryor disappeared into the back to pull the order, Rowan stood at the counter and didn't talk to her, which she found she didn't mind. Most men, when left alone with a woman they didn't know, felt some compulsion to fill the silence. Rowan apparently felt no such compulsion. She looked around the store. Seeds in paper envelopes, leatherwork, a row of canned goods, a bulletin board on the wall near the door, covered in notices. Land for sale, cattle for hire, a man named Hollis looking for his spotted dog, a notice about a town meeting regarding the proposed irrigation ditch. A frontier. That was what this was. A real one. Not the romantic notion of it that Eastern newspapers peddled with illustrations of noble pioneers and golden sunsets. This was mud and nails and a bulletin board and a man named Pryor with an ambitious mustache, and 12 miles outside of town there was a ranch she'd never seen and a life she couldn't picture. She'd made worse gambles. She'd had worse starting positions. You can do this, she told herself. It didn't feel true yet, but she'd learned that the truth of a thing sometimes lagged behind the decision, and you had to move before you believed. The wagon ride was quiet for the first several miles. Good road, then bad road, then something that was more of a suggestion of a road through open grassland that rolled away on all sides under a sky so big it felt almost aggressive about it. She'd grown up in cities. She hadn't known sky could come in that quantity. "It's flat," she said, because she needed to say something, and that was what was true. "Flatter farther south," Rowan said. "Is that better or worse?" He thought about it. Neither. Just different. She looked out at the grass moving in long waves. "How long have you been out here?" 8 years. "Where were you before?" A pause. Not evasive, exactly. More like he was deciding how much of the answer was relevant. "Tennessee. Before that, the war." She didn't ask which side. That question carried its own artillery in 1873, and she'd learned to leave it alone. "What made you come to Texas?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Needed somewhere to start from zero." She understood that. "Do you have family?" she asked. "Brother, back in Tennessee. We don't write much." He paused. "You?" "No," she said. "Not anymore." He didn't ask what that meant. She appreciated it more than she could have said. The ranch appeared before she was ready for it, which is generally how things appear. It was not what she'd pictured, and she wasn't sure what she'd pictured. A main house of weathered timber, solid-looking but plain, with a covered porch that ran the full front length, a barn in better repair than the house, 2 smaller outbuildings, a corral with 5 horses, a kitchen garden along the south side of the house, currently just turned earth and the dead stakes of last year's plants, A cottonwood tree stood at the eastern edge of the yard, thick and old and tall enough that you could see it from a distance before you saw anything else. It had the look of a thing that had made up its mind to stay. "It's not much to look at," Rowan said. It wasn't an apology, more like an honest accounting. "It doesn't have to look like anything," Lydia said. "It has to work." He glanced at her sideways. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Not quite surprise, but somewhere in the neighborhood of both. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you around. We'll chat." He showed her the house first. 2 bedrooms, a main room, a kitchen that was functional, if not generous, a cast-iron stove that he said burned through wood fast, but through heat well. The floors were bare wood, well swept. The windows had curtains, which surprised her. Plain flour sack cloth, bleached nearly white, but curtains nonetheless. "You put those up?" she asked. Figured the place needed something," he said, with a trace of something that might, under different circumstances, have been embarrassment. She looked at them for a moment. This man, she supposed, had cut fabric and hemmed it and hung it because a bare window felt like it needed addressing. She didn't know what to do with that information exactly, but she stored it. He showed her the second bedroom. Hers, he made clear without fanfare. There was a bed, a washstand, a small chest of drawers. The window faced east. She would get the morning light. "I made an arrangement with the local preacher," he said, standing in the doorway. "He'll come out Saturday for the ceremony, if you decide to go through with it." He looked at her directly. "But that's your choice, Miss Ashcroft. I want to be clear about that. You don't have to decide today, and you don't have to decide in my favor. If you get out here and decide this isn't what you want, I'll take you back to town. No argument, no hard feelings, and I'll pay for your ticket wherever you need to go." Lydia had prepared herself for a lot of things. She had not prepared herself for this. "Why?" she said. "Most men in your position would—" "I know what most men would do," he said, and there was something flat and certain in his voice that suggested he'd seen it, or something near it. "I'm not most men. I need a partner, not a prisoner." He shrugged, and the shrug was slightly uncomfortable, like he wasn't accustomed to making speeches. "That's all. I'll be in the barn." He left. Lydia sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress had given the middle, like something that had held up a lot of sleeping and was tired of it. She pressed her palms flat against her knees and looked out the east-facing window at the cottonwood tree and the grass beyond it. And she waited for the feeling she'd carried since Philadelphia, that particular cold clutch of being trapped, to arrive and settle back in. It didn't come. That frightened her more than almost anything else. His name was not one she'd been given. That was the trouble with fear that had lived in you long enough. It stopped needing to announce itself. He was simply there, the way a bruise was there, the way a locked door was there. His full name was Edmund Voss. He was 51 years old, and he had the kind of money that made other men's money look like an apology. He owned 3 cotton warehouses in Philadelphia, a shipping company, a man named Grisham who did things that couldn't be put in writing, and Charles, until recently, he had believed he owned Lydia Ashcroft. Lydia had come to him 6 years ago through her uncle, who had debts that needed settling and a niece he was willing to use as settlement. She had been 18. She had not fully understood what was happening until it had already happened, and by then she had been inside a world with very specific rules and very specific consequences for breaking them. She hadn't been his wife. His wife had died years earlier, leaving him a daughter he ignored and a reputation he burnished. Lydia had been something harder to name. A companion, he called her, in the way that certain men use that word, which is to say with a possessiveness that had nothing to do with companionship. She had run his household. She had appeared at his dinners. She had worn what he selected and spoken when he permitted and stayed silent when he required it. She had also, over 4 years, watched and listened and filed away the things that a man like Voss assumed a woman like her would never think to use. The split lip, the night she finally ran, hadn't come from him directly. He was too careful for that. It had come from Grisham, who delivered a message about what happened to women who entertained ideas above their station, and the message had left her with a cut mouth and 2 cracked ribs, and the absolute clarity that comes from understanding, fully and without qualification, that you will die in this life if you stay in it. She had taken what she could carry. She had taken the list she'd built over 4 years, dates, names, The particular shipment to Charleston she wasn't supposed to know about. She had taken a train to New York, then another to Baltimore, then one more west. And she had answered an advertisement in a newspaper because Texas was far and a married woman's legal position was marginally, only marginally, but enough, harder to undo than an unmarried one's. She had not told Rowan Hale any of this. His 43 words had not invited confession, and she had not offered one. She sat on the edge of a bed in a ranch house in Texas and understood that she had outrun one life and not yet arrived in another. She was in the space between, which was a terrible place to be, and also, she thought, the only honest place she'd occupied in years. She got up. She unpacked her suitcase. It didn't take long. And she changed into work clothes because there was always work, and work was always better than sitting. He had a ranch hand named Pete DeLacy, a 20-year-old from Galveston who had arrived the previous summer and stayed because the wages were honest and the work was manageable, and Rowan Hale didn't talk to you like you were an idiot. Pete was rangy and sun-baked and had the kind of relentless cheerfulness that either wore you down or won you over. And when Lydia appeared at the barn door in her working clothes and asked what needed doing, he stared at her for a solid 3 seconds before looking at Rowan. Rowan didn't look up from the harness he was mending. "Show her the feeding routine," he said. Pete showed her. He talked constantly while he did it, which would have irritated her under different circumstances, but which she found, out here, oddly anchoring. Something warm and undemanding to navigate through while she tried to learn the shape of the place. The horses were 5. A big gray named Copperhead, which struck her as an alarming name for a horse, 2 bays that belonged to the working cattle operation, a smaller roan that Rowan apparently used most days, and an older sorrel who Pete said was named Mrs. Pemberton and had opinions about being brushed. "Why Mrs. Pemberton?" she asked. "Because she acts like someone who's been insulted at a church social and never got over it," Pete said. She laughed. It came out before she could think about whether it was appropriate, and it sounded slightly rusty, like something that had been sitting unused. Pete looked pleased with himself. She fed the horses. She did it carefully and correctly, the way she did most things that were new to her. Methodically, without cutting corners, paying attention to the individual temperaments. Mrs. Pemberton did, in fact, have opinions, and expressed them by pinning her ears when Lydia came too close to her left shoulder, but ultimately took her oats without escalating. "She likes you," Pete said. "Usually she tries to bite." "I figured she just needed to be asked instead of told," Lydia said. She felt Rowan watching her from the other end of the barn. When she looked, he was back at the harness. Dinner that first night was plain and competent: salt pork, beans, cornbread, and Pete ate with them because apparently he always ate with them. And the meal had an established rhythm to it that felt lived in, comfortable in the way a well-worn boot was comfortable. They talked about practical things: which section of fence the cattle had been pushing against, whether it would rain before the weekend, what Rowan needed to do about the east well, which was going brackish. No one asked her about Philadelphia. No one asked her about her family. Pete asked her if she could cook, with the frank curiosity of someone for whom this was purely logistical information, and she said yes, she could. And he said that was good because Rowan cooked like someone who thought food was only relevant as fuel. Rowan said, "That's not unfair." She looked at him across the table. He was eating in that same quiet, unhurried way he did everything. He caught her looking and didn't look away, which was something she wasn't quite prepared for. Men usually looked away, or they held her gaze in a way that was meant to show dominance. He just looked back, evenly, the way you looked at someone you were trying to understand. "Is there anything you need tonight?" he asked. "No," she said. "Thank you," he nodded. "Breakfast is early. Pete will show you where things are if you want to start cooking mornings. If you don't, we manage. If you don't, we manage." He kept doing that, offering and immediately releasing the offer, leaving it clean of any obligation. She didn't know what to do with a man who didn't collect debts. She didn't sleep well the first night. She rarely did anywhere new, and the sounds were all wrong. The particular silence of open country, occasionally interrupted by wind and the distant complaint of cattle, so different from the city that it registered almost like a different language. She lay in the dark and listened and thought about the things she always thought about at 3 a.m, which were the things she spent the daylight hours not thinking about. She thought about the list she'd brought with her, the dates, the names, the Charleston shipment. She'd kept them in a letter, sealed, addressed to a lawyer in New York whose name she'd found through careful inquiry and whose reputation for discretion toward women in difficult situations she'd had confirmed through channels she preferred not to examine too closely. The letter was the only protection she had. If something happened to her, it would be opened. Voss would not want it opened. It wasn't much. It was what she had. She thought about Rowan Hale's curtains, which she hadn't been able to stop thinking about since she'd first seen them. And she was not sure why plain flour sack curtains on a window in a ranch house in Texas should have the power to make her throat feel tight. But they did. She thought about his words. I need a partner, not a prisoner. She pressed her hands flat on the mattress. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood tree and made a sound like breathing. She would give this 3 months, she decided. If she was wrong about him, if the curtains and the 43 words and the 3 feet of distance were all some performance she didn't yet understand, she would know in 3 months. She knew how to watch for signs. She'd been watching for 4 years. And if she was right about him, if he was, against all probability, exactly what he seemed, then she would figure out what to do with that. She had no practice in it, but she could learn. She'd learned worse things. 3 months, she told herself. She was still awake at 4 in the morning when the roosters started, and she got up and went to the kitchen because she had promised herself years ago that she would not wait for permission to move. She had the coffee on before Rowan came in from the barn, where he'd apparently been for an hour already. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw her and looked at the coffee pot with an expression that she could only describe as cautious appreciation. Early, he said. I'm always early, she said. Good. He got 2 cups from the shelf, set one in front of her without being asked, poured for them both and sat down across the table and drank his coffee in a silence that she found, to her own considerable confusion, comfortable. I'll need to know the ranch, she said after a while. All of it. Where everything is, what the routines are, what's been tried and what hasn't. I can't be useful if I don't know what I'm working with. He looked at her over his cup. I'll take you through it today, after the morning feeding. Good. You have any experience with cattle? No, but I learned fast. I know. She raised an eyebrow. The horses, he said. Last night. You figured out Mrs. Pemberton in 10 minutes. She was a problem for a month before I gave up and just worked around her. Lydia considered this. She wasn't being difficult. She just wanted to be approached on her terms. Yeah, Rowan said. I figured that out when I saw you do it. Outside, the sun was coming up hard and red over the flat Texas horizon. It was gaudy and enormous and completely indifferent to everything, and it lit up the kitchen through the east window and landed on the plain flour sack curtains and threw a warm color that was almost amber. She wrapped her hands around her cup and felt something she was not going to name yet, something too fragile to look at directly, settle somewhere behind her sternum. 3 months, she thought. Maybe 3 months. He took her through the ranch after breakfast. All of it. The full 1,200 acres, the creek that ran along the northern boundary, the sections he was running cattle on, and the sections that needed another season before they'd be ready, the fence lines and where they were weak, the eastern well, and the problem with it. He talked while they rode, more than she'd expected. Once he was on ground, he knew, though it was still economy, not abundance. He told her things because she needed to know them, not because he liked the sound of his own voice. She filed everything carefully. She was good at filing things carefully. At one point, riding along the northern fence, he stopped and pointed to a section where the posts were leaning. That whole run needs resetting, he said. I've been putting it off because it's 2 days of work and Pete and I have been managing the calving. What do you need for it? Post driver, rope, and someone to hold while I swing. Pete's too light. I'm not, she said. He looked at her with that sideways measuring look. Those posts weigh 40 pounds. I know what a fence post weighs, she said, which was not technically true, but she'd looked at the posts and she was willing to back herself. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, more like the structural suggestion of one. Saturday, he said, after the preacher comes. Then, if you decide to stay. I'll be here Saturday, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he clicked his tongue at the roan, and they moved on down the fence line, and the spring wind came across the grass, cold and clean, and smelling like rain that was still 2 days away. And Lydia Ashcroft rode across land that was not yet hers, but might become so, and tried to remember the last time she had made a decision that was only about what she wanted. She couldn't, quite, but she thought she might be about to make one. The week before the ceremony had its own momentum. She learned the kitchen, really learned it, not the cursory familiarity of someone passing through, but the detailed practical knowledge of someone who intended to run it. She learned which shelf held what, where the cold storage was, how the stove behaved in the morning versus the evening. She cooked for all three of them, and it was not elegant, but it was solid and plentiful. And Pete ate with the focused gratitude of a young man who had spent several months eating Rowan's cooking. She helped with the fence posts. Rowan had been right. They were heavy. And she was sore for 2 days after, in muscles she'd never specifically needed before. But the fence was reset and solid, and there was a satisfaction in it that was almost physical, that lived in her hands and her back, and the complaining of her shoulders. And she thought, this is what it feels like to build something. She made herself useful in every way she could identify. Not frantically, not desperately. She'd learned that desperation was something people sensed, and that it changed the way they treated you, steadily, with attention and without making noise about it. Rowan noticed. He didn't say much about it, but she could tell he noticed. In the way you could tell, the slight adjustment in how he spoke to her, the ease that came into the silence between them, the way he started consulting her about small things, the way you consulted someone whose judgment you'd begun to trust. On Friday evening, the night before the preacher was due, he found her in the kitchen garden, turning soil and pulling last year's dead roots. The sun was going down and the air had gone cool, and the light was that particular late-day gold that made even a piece of bare Texas earth look like it had potential. He stood at the edge of the garden and watched her work for a moment. "You don't have to do this," he said. She didn't look up. "I know." "I mean the garden. It can wait." "I know it can." She pulled out a root that resisted and then gave. "I don't want it to wait. I want it done." He was quiet. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "I'll be here tomorrow," she said. "I've decided." He looked at her. That careful, unhurried look that she was starting to understand was just how he saw things. Not assessment, not strategy, just attention. "All right," he said. "Do you want to ask me anything?" she said. "About who I am or where I came from?" Another pause. "When you're ready to tell me," he said, "you'll tell me." She looked at him. The last light was behind him, and she couldn't see his face well, but his voice was level and without pressure, and she believed him. "Thank you," she said, "for the curtains." He made a sound that was almost definitely not a laugh, but lived next to one. "They look terrible," he said. "They look fine. The hemming is uneven." "I didn't notice," she lied. He moved away toward the barn. She turned back to the earth, and her hands were steady in it, working through the cold soil, making room for the things that would come up green in a few weeks if she tended them. And the cottonwood tree stood at the edge of the yard in the last of the light, enormous and old and utterly unmoved by all the small human urgency happening around it. Her hands were steady. She noted that, marked it the way she marked all evidence, carefully and without drawing conclusions too fast. But her hands were steady. After a long time, they were steady. And that felt like something, maybe even something true. The preacher who married them was a short man named Caldwell, who smelled like horse liniment and spoke with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this many times and understood that the words mattered less than the people saying them. He came out on a Saturday morning in a wagon that had seen better decades, read from a small book he kept in his coat pocket, and was back on the road to town before noon. Pete DeLacy stood as witness. He'd put on a clean shirt for the occasion and had made some attempt at his hair, which had not fully cooperated. He shook Rowan's hand after and then turned to Lydia with an expression of genuine warmth that she found unexpectedly moving. "Welcome to the operation," he said. "For what it's worth, you're already the best cook we've had." "That's a very low bar," she said. "Ma'am, you have no idea." Rowan had shaken the preacher's hand, signed the paper, and then stood in the yard looking slightly like a man who had just realized a thing was real that had until recently been theoretical. He wasn't uncomfortable, exactly. He was just adjusting, the way you adjusted to a change in weather. Lydia understood the feeling. She was doing the same thing herself. They didn't speak much that first afternoon as husband and wife. There was work, which there always was, and the work was the same as it had been the day before. And that sameness was, she thought, probably the most honest thing about the arrangement. Nothing had transformed. They had simply made a thing official that had already begun. That night, after Pete had gone to the bunkhouse and the dishes were done, she and Rowan sat on the covered porch in the cooling dark. He had a cup of coffee. She had one too. The stars were enormous out here. Another thing the city hadn't prepared her for, the sheer quantity of them, the way they pressed down close on clear nights like they were interested in what was happening below. "You're not what I expected," he said. She looked at him sideways. "What did you expect?" He thought about it. "Someone more," he paused. "I don't know. More willing to be told what to do. Is that a complaint?" "No." He said it without hesitation. "It's an observation." She looked back at the stars. "What you put in your letter. 43 words. I counted. It said honest work and honest dealing. Nothing about obedience." "No," he said. "It didn't." "Then we agree." He drank his coffee. The silence was easy. Not the silence of things avoided, but the silence of people who were comfortable enough not to fill every space with noise. "You counted the words," he said after a while. There was something in his voice she couldn't quite categorize. Amusement, maybe. Quiet surprise. "I count things when I'm trying to understand them," she said. "And did you understand it?" "Enough to come," she said. April came in uncertain, warm one day, cold the next, the sky changing its mind every few hours the way spring skies did out on the plain. Lydia settled into the work of the ranch the way she settled into most things, by learning the grain of it, finding where the resistance was, figuring out how to move with it rather than against it. The cattle operation was larger than she'd initially grasped, 340 head running on the north and east sections with calving season just winding down. Rowan and Pete worked long days through it, and she worked alongside them when she could, learning faster than either of them seemed to anticipate. She wasn't strong the way Pete was strong, and she didn't have Rowan's years of accumulated instinct, but she was precise, and she was patient, and she didn't make the same mistake twice. She also, within 2 weeks of arriving, reorganized the household accounts. This was something Rowan had been keeping in a leather-bound ledger with a system that might charitably be described as approximate. She didn't comment on the system. She simply sat down with the ledger one evening and worked through it, and presented him the following morning with a clear accounting of where they stood and where the pressure points were. He looked at it for a long time. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. "I kept house for someone who had a complicated financial life," she said. It was true as far as it went. "You learn bookkeeping or you don't keep up?" He turned another page. "We're spending too much at Pryor's on rope." "You're buying it in small quantities," she said. "If you order in bulk from the supplier in San Antonio, it's 40 cents cheaper per coil. Over a year, that's considerable," he said. "Yes." He closed the ledger. "Do you want to handle the accounts going forward?" "Yes," she said. "All right." He handed her the ledger. "It's yours." She held it and thought about what it meant. Not just the ledger, but the handing, the ease of it. He hadn't made a show of trust. He'd simply extended it, the way you handed someone a tool because they were the right person to use it. She didn't know what to do with that ease, so she just took the ledger and got to work. The neighboring ranchers began appearing in April, drawn by the particular frontier combination of curiosity and practicality. A ranch with a new woman was both an event and a resource. Events provided conversation, and resources provided the kind of mutual support that kept people alive out here. The first was Margaret Holt, who ran the adjacent spread with her husband Chet, and had the kind of energy that filled a room from the doorway. She arrived one morning on a spotted horse with a jar of pickled vegetables and an agenda she didn't bother concealing. "I wanted to meet you before the gossip did," Margaret said, setting the jar on Lydia's kitchen table with the authority of someone who had decided they were going to like this kitchen. "What's the gossip?" Lydia asked. "That you're from back east and you don't know what you're getting into out here." Margaret sat down without being invited, which Lydia decided to take as a compliment. "I told Chet that was probably half true." "Which half?" "You're from back east," Margaret said, "but you reset the north fence line last week, which means you know a thing or two, or you're willing to learn, which amounts to the same thing out here." Lydia put coffee on. "You can see the north fence line from your property?" "I can see everything from my property. I have a hill." Margaret said it with the satisfaction of a woman who had thought about the strategic value of that hill and was pleased with it. Rowan doing all right? He's fine. He's a hard man to get a straight answer from, is what he is. Good rancher, though. Honest, which out here is rarer than good fencing. She looked at Lydia directly. How are you doing? And I mean actually not the answer you give when you don't know someone well enough yet. Lydia looked at her. Margaret Holt had a face that had been outdoors too long in too much sun, and eyes that were a very direct shade of green, and the manner of a person who didn't ask questions she didn't want answered. I'm adjusting, Lydia said. It's different than anything I've done before, but I'd rather be adjusting than the alternative. Fair enough. Margaret accepted the coffee. What's the alternative? Going back, Lydia said simply. Margaret studied her for a moment, and something in the green eyes shifted. A small recognition, the kind between women who have both understood at some point that going back was not always a direction available to them. Well, Margaret said, you're here now. And I'll tell you what I told the last woman who moved out onto this plain. The land doesn't care who you were before. It just cares whether you show up. That sounds like something I can work with, Lydia said. Margaret raised her coffee cup in something that was almost a toast. The weeks accumulated. The calves grew. The kitchen garden Lydia had started clearing in her first week began to show green in the rows she'd planted. Beans and squash and a row of something that Pete was convinced were tomatoes, and Rowan was privately less certain about, though he didn't say so. The east fence went in correctly, the brackish well got dug out and ran cleaner for it, and Lydia learned to read the Texas sky well enough to know when to get the horses in before a squall hit. She was not happy, exactly. Happiness was a thing she'd put away a long time ago and wasn't sure she could locate the particular box it was stored in. But she was something that felt more like solid ground than she'd stood on in years. She woke up in the morning with things to do that were hers. She went to sleep at night with something that was close to satisfaction, if not quite that word. Rowan was complicated, not in ways that alarmed her, in ways that required paying attention, which she was good at. He was quiet, not withdrawn. There was a difference, and she'd learned it early. A withdrawn person was absent even when they were present, locked behind something. Rowan was fully present. He just didn't feel the need to narrate it. He noticed things. He remembered things she'd said 2 weeks ago and referenced them without fanfare, the way you referenced things that mattered to you. He was patient in a way that was not passivity. She'd seen him move fast when fast was required, seen the decisiveness that lived under the stillness, but his default was patience, a genuine willingness to let things unfold at the pace they needed. He was also stubborn, not unreasonably so, but he had opinions about how things should be done, and he held them with the quiet tenacity of a man who had arrived at them through experience rather than habit. She disagreed with him sometimes, and when she did, she said so. And the first time she'd contradicted him directly about a grazing rotation decision, he'd gone quiet in a way that she'd been prepared to defend herself against. He'd thought about it for a full day. Then he'd come to her in the kitchen the next evening and said, "You were right about the south pasture. We'll rotate as you suggested." That was it. No hedging, no wounded pride made into her problem. He'd been wrong and she'd been right, and he said so and moved on. She had not experienced that before. It took her 3 days to stop waiting for the consequence that didn't come. It was a Tuesday in late April, 6 weeks after the ceremony, when the letter arrived. She was in town with Rowan to resupply, a necessary trip she'd been integrating into her schedule with the efficiency that had become her signature contribution to the ranch's logistics. She was at Pryor's confirming the bulk rope order she'd arranged, when the postmaster, a thin man named Elbert, who ran the combined post-telegraph notary office with the solemnity of someone overseeing something considerably more important, called her name. "Mrs. Hale." He held out an envelope. She took it. The handwriting on the outside was not a hand she recognized. The postmark was Philadelphia. Her stomach dropped the way a floor drops in a bad dream, sudden and total. She put it in her pocket. She finished the conversation with Pryor. She helped load the wagon. She did not open the letter until that evening, after dinner, when Rowan was in the barn and Pete was in the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was quiet. The letter was from a woman named Agnes Farrow, who had been, for 3 years, the housekeeper in Edmund Voss's Philadelphia house. Agnes was not educated, but she was determined, and the letter was misspelled in several places and entirely coherent in its meaning. He knows where you went. He has a man looking. I thought you should know. I am sorry I could not do more. Be careful. Lydia read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in both hands and looked at the kitchen wall for a long time. She had known this was possible. She had not let herself believe it would be probable, which was a distinction she'd made out of necessity, because you couldn't function properly if you spent every day expecting the worst to arrive. But she had known. She had the letter sealed in New York, she had the list, and she had known. She heard Rowan's boots on the porch. She folded Agnes's letter smaller and tucked it into her apron pocket. He came in and looked at her, one of those full attention looks he had, and she understood that whatever she was doing with her face wasn't quite working. What happened? He said. Nothing urgent, she said. He crossed to the wash basin, cleaned his hands. His back was to her. Lydia. She hadn't gotten used to hearing her name said plainly, without demand or accusation in it. He said it the way you said a person's name when you meant them specifically. Someone from Philadelphia wrote to me, she said. A warning. He turned around, dried his hands, looked at her with the same expression he brought to a fence that needed assessing. Present, careful, not alarmed but not dismissing what he was seeing. The person you were running from, he said. It wasn't a question. He'd had the outlines of it, she understood. Had maybe always had the outlines of it, from the split lip that had faded but not entirely disappeared in the weeks she'd been here, from the way she listened for footsteps before she'd trained herself not to, from the 43 words she'd answered instead of something more inviting. He wasn't stupid, and he'd had 6 weeks. Yes, she said. Who is he? She told him. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Boss's name, what he was, what the years inside his world had looked like. She told it plainly, without her voice going up or down much, the way she'd learned to talk about hard things, which was like reporting the weather. Here is the condition, here is what it means, here is what needs to be done about it. Rowan listened. He didn't interrupt. His face didn't change much, it never changed much, but his jaw set in a way she'd come to recognize as something other than stillness. He has money, she said, and he has people. I have something that could hurt him if it got to the right people, but that's a lever, not a solution. What kind of something? She hesitated. Records, dates, and names from a shipment he ran through Charleston that wasn't legal. I have the specifics in a letter with a lawyer in New York, sealed, with instructions for what happens if I stop being findable. She looked at him. I want you to know that. I want you to understand that I'm not without protection. But I also want you to understand what you may be dealing with, because I should have told you before, and I didn't. And that was, Lydia, he said. She stopped. You told me you'd tell me when you were ready, he said. You're telling me. She looked at him. You're not angry. Why would I be angry? Because I brought this with me. Because it's a risk I put in your life without... You put it in your own life first, he said, and you came here because you were trying to get out of it. He pulled a chair out from the table and sat down, which was somehow the most calming thing anyone could have done in that moment, the simple mundaneness of sitting down. So, what do you need? She blinked. I need you to know that's what I needed. All right, he said. Now I know. He laced his fingers together on the table. Does he know you're married? He knows I went west. I don't know what else he knows. Married woman's harder to move without legal argument, he said. If he sends someone with papers, we need to be ready for that. He paused. Judge Carver in Tallow Creek, he's honest. If it comes to a legal question, Carver's the right man. I've known him 6 years. Lydia looked at her husband, a word she was still adjusting to, sitting at her kitchen table with his hands folded and his face set and his mind already working through the practical requirements of her very complicated past. And she felt something move in her chest that was difficult to name and that she wasn't going to try to name yet because she was a careful person who didn't draw conclusions before she had the evidence. But something moved. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. We're in this together. That was the arrangement. He stood up. I'll talk to the Holts tomorrow. And Calhoun, 2 miles south. People out here look out for each other when they know what to look out for. He started toward the door. Rowan. He stopped. I should have told you sooner, she said. He considered that. Maybe, he said, but you told me now and we have time to deal with it. That's what matters. He went to bed. She sat at the kitchen table for a while, in the quiet, with the lamp burning low, and Agnes Farrow's letter in her apron pocket, and the faint smell of turned earth coming through the window from the kitchen garden. She thought about what it meant that he had said we. Said it without ceremony, without making it into a statement. Just, we're in this together. The way you said something that was simply true. She had spent 4 years in a world where other people's we always cost her something. Had never, until now, been offered one that didn't have a price attached. May brought the kind of hard weather that the Texas plain had in its repertoire, but didn't advertise in advance. A cold front dropped down from the north in the second week with a ferocity that was almost personal. Temperatures plunging 40 degrees in 6 hours, driving sleet that came in horizontal and stung like thrown gravel. The cattle moving in tight, miserable groups against the fence lines trying to find shelter that wasn't there. All hands worked. There was no other option. Lydia worked beside Rowan and Pete for 36 hours nearly straight, moving cattle, reinforcing the barn, breaking the ice on the water troughs every few hours so the animals could drink. She wore 3 layers and still felt the cold in her bones. Her hands cracked and bled in the dry sleet air, and she wrapped them and kept working. Pete, at the 20-hour mark, looked at her across a water trough and said, with genuine feeling, "No offense, Mrs. Hale, but I've worked alongside men who quit before now." "Don't tell me that," she said, wringing out the rag she'd been using to wipe ice. "I'm too tired to feel good about it." He laughed, which turned into a cough. "We make it through this. I'm sleeping for a week." "You can sleep Sunday," she said. "We've got fence to check Monday." Pete groaned with feeling. They made it through. 15 head lost. Not a catastrophe, Rowan said, given the conditions, but not nothing either. They spent the better part of a week afterward repairing what the storm had damaged and accounting for what it had taken, and there was a grim quiet to that accounting that Lydia had not experienced before. The specific weight of loss that came from something you'd built being partially undone by circumstances you couldn't control. She watched Rowan walk the property after, counting what remained, making notes. His face was tired and set. He didn't perform grief, didn't make it visible the way some people needed to, but it was there, in the set of his shoulders and the way he moved through the damaged sections of fence with a kind of slowness that wasn't physical. She fell into step beside him one afternoon, the 3rd day of the accounting. 15, she said. 15, he agreed. At current market, that's... I know what it is. She looked at the fence line. We can make it back by fall. The grazing rotation I proposed. If we push it 2 weeks earlier, we can get better weight on the remaining stock before market. He didn't say anything for a while. They walked. The ground was still muddy from the melt. You've been doing calculations, he said. It's what I do when things go wrong, she said. It helps. He looked at her sideways. Does it actually help? She thought about it. It makes me feel like the problem has edges, she said. Like it's a shape I can work with instead of just something that happened to us. He stopped walking, looked at the fence, then at her. All right, he said, show me the rotation. She showed him that evening at the kitchen table with the ledger and a sketch she'd made of the property sections. He listened. He asked 3 questions, each of which was specific and pointed and showed that he understood what he was looking at. He made one adjustment that she acknowledged was better than what she'd proposed. We'll do it, he said. They'd been talking for an hour. The lamp was burning between them, and the kitchen smelled like coffee, and the damp wool of their coats drying near the stove, and Rowan Hale was sitting across from her with his elbows on the table, fully present in the way he always was, and she thought, I trust him. She thought it plainly, without qualifications or conditions for the first time. Not, I think I can trust him, or I trust him so far, or I'll give it another month. Just, I trust him. The way you arrived at a conclusion when you finally had enough evidence. It was not a comfortable feeling, exactly. Trust, when you weren't used to it, felt less like relief and more like exposure. Like removing armor you'd worn so long you'd forgotten it was armor. But she held the feeling and didn't push it away. The news came on a Friday in early June, not by letter this time, but by a stranger who rode into Tallow Creek and started asking questions. Margaret Holt brought the information herself, arriving at a hard trot on her spotted horse, which told Lydia before Margaret even dismounted that this was not a social call. "Man in town," Margaret said, swinging down, "asking about a woman matching your description. Older, well-dressed, said he was a business associate of someone looking for a family member." Lydia's chest went cold. "Which saloon?" she said. "The Rattler. Pryor says he's been there since yesterday evening. Bought several rounds, which is how he got people talking." Margaret's green eyes were sharp and steady. "Is this what I think it is?" "Yes," Lydia said. "Rowan know?" "He knows what might be coming. I need to tell him it's here." She was already moving toward the barn. "Can you stay?" "I sent Chet to get Elgin Calhoun," Margaret said, which answered the question and also confirmed that Margaret Holt had already started pulling a network into place before she'd arrived. "We'll be here." Rowan was mending tack when she came in. He looked up at her face and put the tack down. She told him. Quickly, cleanly, the way she'd learned to deliver difficult information. The shape of it first, then the details. He listened without interrupting, his jaw set in the way she knew. "He'll come here," Rowan said. It wasn't a question. "If he's doing what Voss told him to do, yes. He needs to see whether I'm here and whether I can be removed." She said the word flatly because it was the accurate word. "He can't force anything without papers, but he can report back and Voss can get papers or manufacture them. He has people who can manufacture things." "Then we get to Carver first," Rowan said. He stood up. "Today." "Rowan, Carver needs to know the situation before anyone presents him with a version of it that leaves you out." He was already moving toward the door, already putting the situation in front of him like a problem with edges. "Get your records. Whatever you have, copies of what's in New York if you have them here, anything. We're going to town." She had copies. She'd kept them because she wasn't a person who left herself without a fallback. She'd kept them in the bottom of the chest of drawers in her room, wrapped in oilcloth inside a false-bottom sewing box she'd built herself over 3 evenings when Rowan and Pete were working the east section. She got them. She met Rowan in the yard where he'd already saddled the roan and a bay mare. Margaret was on the porch with her coffee, watching the road. Pete was visible near the barn, doing something that was probably covering the approaching road, though he wouldn't have phrased it that way. Lydia mounted. Her hands were steady. She noted that, not with relief, but with something that felt like recognition, a person finding out who they were in a situation that asked. "Ready," she said. Rowan looked at her. One of his full attention looks, the kind she'd been cataloging for 2 months. There was something in it now that hadn't been there in the beginning. Something that wasn't just assessment. Something that had more weight to it. "We go to Carver," he said. "We lay it out clean, and then—" He paused. "Whatever comes after, we face it together." She met his eyes. 2 months ago she would have flinched from that, from the word together, from the expectation it implied. She didn't flinch now. "Together," she said. They rode toward town, and the June sun was already high and hot on the plain, and the cottonwood tree fell behind them and disappeared, and ahead the road stretched flat and direct toward Tallow Creek, and Lydia Ashcroft, Lydia Hale, rode toward what was coming with her back straight and her eyes open, and something that had no clean name burning in her chest, steady as a banked fire, waiting for whatever the next hour required of her. She was not afraid. She was many things, but she was not afraid. And that, she thought, that was new. Judge Carver's office was on the second floor of a building that also housed a dentist and a land registry clerk, and the stairs leading up to it creaked in a way that announced every visitor before they arrived. Lydia had climbed them twice in her life. Once, 3 weeks after arriving in Tallow Creek, when Rowan had introduced her to the judge over a matter of property documentation. And now, today, with a sewing box of evidence under her arm and a man asking questions in the saloon 2 streets over. Carver was 60, maybe a few years past it, with white hair and the particular posture of a man who had spent decades making decisions he had to live with. He was not impressive in the way that powerful men sometimes performed impressiveness. He was small and a little rumpled, and he wore reading spectacles that he was always misplacing, but his eyes behind those spectacles were sharp as a hawk's and twice as patient. He was at his desk when they came in. He looked at Rowan, then at Lydia, then at the sewing box. "Sit down," he said. They sat. Lydia laid out the situation. She'd been rehearsing it on the ride over, organizing it the way she organized everything, by shape, by sequence, by what mattered most to establish first. She told it plainly and without embellishment, because embellishment was what you did when the plain facts weren't enough, and she had decided the plain facts were more than enough. Edmund Voss. The arrangement with her uncle. The years in his household. The night she'd run. The list of the Charleston shipment, a cargo of goods that had cleared Philadelphia customs under false documentation, goods that the Federal Revenue Office would find considerably interesting. The lawyer in New York, the sealed letter, the terms she'd set, and the man currently in the Rattler Saloon who had ridden into Tallow Creek asking questions about a woman matching her description. Carver listened. He didn't write anything down, which she'd half expected, but she understood, watching him, that he didn't need to. He was filing it, the way she filed things, into some internal order that would let him retrieve it accurately. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He took his spectacles off and polished them on his shirt, which she suspected was something he did when he was thinking rather than because the glasses needed cleaning. "The man in the saloon," he said. "Has he presented any legal instrument? Warrant? Writ? Anything of that kind?" "Not yet," Rowan said. "He's asking questions, working up to something." "A married woman in the state of Texas," Carver said, almost to himself, setting the spectacles back on his nose, "cannot be compelled by a private party to relocate against her will. That requires a court order, and a court order requires a legal basis, and the legal basis he'd need to establish," he paused, "would require demonstrating a claim that your marriage doesn't already answer." "He'll try to manufacture one," Lydia said. "Voss is not without resources. He has lawyers. He has people who can write documents that look like other documents." "I'm sure he does," Carver said. He looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Hale, the material you have in New York, is it what you say it is?" "Yes." "Could you get it here if needed? Not just the copies, but the original documentation." "I can telegraph the lawyer today. He can have copies certified and sent." Carver nodded. "Do that." He leaned back in his chair. "In the meantime, I'm going to pay a visit to the Rattler this afternoon. As a judge, not as a social call. I want to know who this man is and whether he's carrying anything that gives him official standing." He looked at Rowan. "If he comes to your property before I've had the chance, what are you going to do?" Rowan said, "Tell him he's trespassing." "And then?" "Then I'll be very clear about what that means in terms of what's going to happen next." Carver looked at him for a moment, then looked at Lydia. "You chose a practical man," he said, which was probably the highest compliment he gave. "I had good information," she said. The man's name was Aldous Grisham, the same Grisham whose name she knew, the same one who had delivered Voss's last message in Philadelphia, the one that had left her with a cut lip and cracked ribs, and the absolute certainty she had to run. She had not known he would be the one Voss sent, and she felt the knowledge of it land somewhere below her sternum like a stone dropped into water. Carver found this out at the Rattler and sent word to the ranch by Pete, who'd waited in town for exactly this purpose, and who rode back hard enough that he was breathless when he delivered it. "Judge says his name is Grisham," Pete said. "Has a card says he's a private legal agent out of Philadelphia. Carver says he's got no papers giving him any authority in the state of Texas, which apparently the judge made very clear." Lydia absorbed this. She was at the kitchen table, the copied documents spread before her. Margaret Holt was on the porch. Elgin Calhoun, a spare, weathered man from 2 miles south, who didn't talk much, but who Rowan had once described as someone you wanted on your side in a tight situation, was in the yard with his rifle leaning against the fence post in a manner that was purely incidental. "Grisham," Rowan said. He was looking at Lydia. "You know that name." "Yes," she said. He waited. "He's the one who—" "The night I left." She kept her voice level. "He was Voss's instrument. Voss doesn't do things himself. Grisham does them." Rowan's face did the thing where it went still in a way that was not calm exactly, but was controlled, where something was happening underneath that he was keeping underneath. "Is he dangerous?" Rowan said. "He does what he's paid to do," Lydia said, "which means what's dangerous is who's paying him and what they've told him to accomplish." "And what's Voss told him to accomplish?" She looked at her husband. "Bring me back, one way or another." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear the wind moving through the cottonwood tree, and Calhoun's boots on the dry earth as he shifted his position, and the distant low of cattle that had no idea about any of this and were infinitely better off for it. "Then he's going to come here," Rowan said. "Might as well be on our terms." "Rowan, he's going to come regardless. We can wait for him to choose the moment, or we can choose it." He looked at her directly. "What do you want to do?" She'd asked herself that question in various forms for 6 years. For most of those years, she hadn't had a real answer because the options available to her hadn't included anything she'd actually choose. The question had been theoretical. It wasn't theoretical anymore. "I want to be here when he comes," she said. "I want to stand in front of him and be the one who speaks." Rowan nodded, like she'd confirmed something he already knew. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. Grisham arrived on a Thursday morning, 6 days after the Friday he'd ridden into Tallow Creek. He'd spent those 6 days, as they'd later pieced together, talking to people in town, carefully, buying drinks, asking questions that felt like other questions, building a picture. He was good at his work. That was the worst thing about him. He was genuinely competent at the specific thing he'd been built to do. He came up the road on a dark horse, dressed in a coat that was too good for the weather and too clean for the terrain, which told you immediately that he was a man who'd arrived from somewhere and intended to leave again shortly. He had a broad face that gave little away, and a way of holding himself that took up slightly more space than the physical facts warranted. He was alone, which Lydia hadn't fully expected. She was on the porch when he rode up. She'd been there for an hour, sitting on the bench with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching the road. Margaret was inside the house. Lydia had asked her to be there and to stay visible through the window but not on the porch, and Margaret had agreed without argument, which was one of the things she'd come to value most about Margaret Holt. Rowan was in the yard between the porch and the gate, doing something with a length of rope that he'd been doing for 40 minutes, and that fooled no one. Elgin Calhoun was not visible. Neither were the two Holt brothers, Margaret's nephews, who'd ridden over 2 days ago and found things to do on the property that kept them in proximity. You didn't see them, but they were there. Grisham rode up to the gate and stopped. He looked at the yard, read the situation with professional speed, and then looked at Lydia on the porch. Something moved in his face, recognition, and beneath that, the particular recalibration of a man who had expected a frightened woman and found a different arrangement. "Mrs. Hale," he said, and the use of her married name was tactical, a demonstration that he'd done his work, a reminder that he knew things. "Mr. Grisham," she said. She kept her voice even and her hands in her lap and her spine against the back of the bench because you didn't give a man like this the satisfaction of watching you stand. He dismounted, tied his horse to the post outside the gate, came through the gate. Rowan didn't stop him, just watched him the way you watched something you'd already decided the outcome of, and stopped 10 feet from the porch steps. "I'm here on behalf of Mr. Edmund Voss," he said. "I expect that doesn't surprise you." "No," she said. "Mr. Voss has an interest in your well-being. He's concerned that you left Philadelphia under—" "Stop," she said. He stopped, looked at her. "I know what you were going to say," she said. "You were going to say I left under difficult circumstances, or in a state of confusion, or something along those lines, something that frames it as his concern for me rather than his claim over me." She kept her voice level and her eyes on his. "I'm not going to sit here and pretend I don't know what this is. And I'm not going to pretend I don't know what you are." Grisham looked at her for a moment. His face was hard to read. It was professionally hard to read, but she'd had 6 years of watching men like him closely. "You've become bold," he said. The tone was neutral. It was a statement, not a compliment or a condemnation. "I've become clear," she said. "It's different." He let that settle. Then he reached into his coat. She saw Rowan's hand move toward his belt, but she gave a small shake of her head, and Rowan held and produced a folded document. "Mr. Voss has engaged legal counsel in the state of Texas," Grisham said, "on the basis that the circumstances of your departure from Philadelphia constitute an actionable breach of a financial arrangement between yourself, your guardian at the time, and Mr. Voss." He held the document out. "This is a notice of intent to file suit." She looked at the document. She did not take it. "My uncle was not my legal guardian at the time," she said. "I was 22 when the arrangement you're describing was made. An adult." which means that any financial agreement made on my behalf without my consent and my signature was not a contract. It was something else. She paused. Your lawyer in Texas knows this. If he drafted that document, he drafted it knowing it would not survive a challenge. Grisham was quiet. Furthermore, she said, I have documentation, currently with a lawyer in New York, and copies of which have been certified and are in the possession of Judge Carver of Tallow Creek, that concerns a shipment of goods through the port of Charleston in the autumn of 1869. Goods that cleared customs under documentation that did not accurately represent their nature or their origin. She kept her eyes on his. Mr. Voss would recognize the date and the manifest. The silence stretched. Behind her, she heard Margaret set something down on a surface inside the house. A cup, probably, placed with deliberate weight. A small sound. A reminder that there was someone behind the door. In the yard, Rowan hadn't moved. He was holding the rope he'd been working with, and his hands were completely still. Grisham's face did something. Not much. He was too controlled for much. But something shifted behind his eyes, the way ice shifts on a river when the temperature changes, before anything visible breaks. Mr. Voss will not be pleased to hear that, Grisham said. No, she said, he won't. But here's what he will hear, because I want you to carry this back to him exactly. She leaned forward slightly, just enough. I am Lydia Hale. I'm a legal resident of the state of Texas, married and documented. I have no obligation, financial or otherwise, to Edmund Voss or to any arrangement made on my behalf without my knowledge or consent. Any legal action he pursues against me in this state will be contested, and in the course of that contest, the documentation I possess will enter the public record. She paused, letting that land. He knows what's in that documentation. He knows what it means. He should think very carefully about whether pursuing this is worth what it will cost him. Grisham stood in the yard of a Texas ranch with a legal document he could not serve, and a message he was going to have to carry back to a man who didn't receive bad news well. The morning sun was full on him, and he looked, for the first time in her experience of him, slightly diminished. Not defeated, not crushed, but smaller than the space he usually occupied. Is that all? He said. There's one more thing. She stood up from the bench, because now it was time to stand. The night I left Philadelphia, what you did, I want you to understand that I remember it. I have not forgotten it, and I have not forgiven it, and I will not. But I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being afraid of it either. She looked at him steadily. You should probably tell him that too. Grisham looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Rowan. Then he looked at the rope in Rowan's hands and the gate he'd come through and the subtle, well-placed stillness of the people who were not visible but were present. He refolded the document and put it back in his coat. I'll deliver your message, he said. He turned and walked back through the gate. He untied his horse. He mounted. And Lydia Hale stood on the porch of her own house in the Texas morning and watched him ride back down the road to Tallow Creek without looking back. And she kept her face and her posture composed until he'd rounded the bend and disappeared. And then she sat down on the bench because her legs had decided they were done for the moment. Rowan was on the porch steps in 3 strides. He didn't touch her, just knelt on the step so his face was level with hers, and looked at her the way he looked at things he was trying to understand. You all right? He said. Ask me in a minute, she said. He waited. He was good at waiting. The minute passed. She pressed her hands flat against her knees. All right, she said. Yes. Margaret came out of the house, let the door bang behind her, and sat down on the other side of the bench with the particular energy of a woman who had been holding herself back for an extended period. That, Margaret said, was one of the finest things I have ever watched happen on a porch. Lydia laughed. It came out somewhat cracked, which was honest. He'll go back to Voss, she said. Voss will think about what I told him. He'll weigh it. And, Rowan said, and I think he'll decide it isn't worth it. She looked at the empty road. He's careful, for all his money and his reach. Careful men don't take risks they can calculate the cost of. You know him that well? Rowan said. I spent 4 years in his house, she said. I know how he thinks. She paused. I also know that what I have on him is real, and he knows it's real, and men like him understand leverage. They respect it even when they hate it. And if he doesn't back down, Rowan said. She thought about the sealed letter in New York, the certified copies with Judge Carver, the dates and names in the Charleston manifest that a federal revenue agent would know exactly what to do with. Then we use the leverage, she said, and he loses considerably more than I do. Judge Carver came to the ranch that afternoon, which she hadn't expected. He rode out himself, which said something about the man. He didn't send word by messenger when he could come himself and see with his own eyes. He sat on the porch and accepted the coffee Lydia brought him and looked at the empty road for a moment. Grisham left town an hour ago, he said, eastbound. I know, Lydia said. You handled it well, he said. I'm going to get the documentation you gave me to the federal contact in San Antonio. Not necessarily to use, but to have registered, officially dated and recorded in a federal office. He looked at her. If Voss ever does come at you again, legally or otherwise, there will be a clear record that this material existed and was in federal hands before any action he might take. Makes it considerably harder for him to claim it was fabricated retroactively. She looked at him. You've done this before. I've been a judge in frontier territory for 14 years, he said. I've seen a lot of things come at a lot of people from places they couldn't see coming. He picked up his coffee cup. I prefer to build fences before the cattle get out. Rowan, sitting on the step, said, I appreciate that. You've built a good operation here, Carver said to Rowan. He said it matter-of-factly, without ceremony. Both of you. He looked at Lydia. The community speaks well of you, Mrs. Hale. That matters out here, as much as the law. Probably more. She thought about Margaret and her spotted horse and her jar of pickled vegetables. She thought about Calhoun leaning on the fence post with his rifle. She thought about the Holt brothers, who'd been on her property for 2 days doing quiet, useful work as a form of solidarity that no one had asked them to articulate, and that she was not going to forget. I know it matters, she said. After Carver left, the day moved toward evening in the way days did after a crisis. Slightly unreal, slightly too quiet. The adrenaline metabolized into something like exhaustion that sat differently than physical tiredness. Margaret went home. Calhoun went home. Pete made himself scarce with the intuition of a young man who recognized when other people needed space. Lydia and Rowan sat on the porch again. Same bench, same positions as weeks ago when they'd talked in the cooling dark and she'd told him about Voss. The sky was doing something dramatic over the western horizon. Streaks of color that the Texas plain seemed to produce in excess, like it was compensating for the flatness by going extravagant in the vertical dimension. It's not over, she said. He might come back. Or send someone else, or find a different angle. I know, Rowan said. I don't want you to think it's over. I don't think it's over. He looked at the sky. But today was different. Today you stood in front of him. He paused. You weren't running. She looked at the colors over the horizon. No, she said, I wasn't. How does that feel? She thought about it carefully, because she didn't want to give the wrong answer. Not for him, but for herself. She owed herself the accurate answer. Like I can breathe, she said, all the way through. Like I haven't been breathing all the way through in a long time. He nodded slowly. Not like it surprised him, like it was the right answer and he was glad to hear it. They sat in silence that was not empty but full. Full of the day that had happened. Full of the people who had shown up and stood in positions that mattered. Full of the particular quality of a thing survived that becomes, slowly, a thing behind you, rather than in front of you. After a while, Rowan said, You were right about the tomatoes. She turned to look at him. In the garden, he said. They're tomatoes. She stared at him for a moment. Then she laughed, a real one, not the cracked kind from earlier, but full and genuine, coming from somewhere that hadn't been accessed in a very long time. I know they're tomatoes, she said. I planted them. Pete said I should admit I wasn't sure, Rowan said. He was not quite smiling, but the area around his eyes was doing something. I'm admitting it. Your faith in me is overwhelming, she said. My faith in your gardening is unconditional, he said. My knowledge of tomatoes was limited. She shook her head and looked back at the sky, still laughing a little. The colors were deepening now, going from dramatic to something that felt almost gentle, and the cottonwood tree was dark against the last of the light, and somewhere in the distance a nightbird was starting up. She thought about Edmund Voss in his Philadelphia warehouse, hearing what Grisham brought back. She thought about the calculation he would make, the specific cold arithmetic of a man who understood risk and consequence. She thought about 4 years, and the locked door, and the life she'd carried on her back like something she hadn't been able to put down. She thought about curtains on a kitchen window, hemmed unevenly. She thought about 43 words in a letter, and the 3 feet of distance a man had kept between them on a first meeting, and a sentence delivered plainly, "I need a partner, not a prisoner." She was not the woman who had stepped off that stagecoach in Tallow Creek. She was not sure she'd been that woman for some time. Actually, she thought the change had happened gradually, the way most real changes happened, without announcing itself, in the daily accumulation of small things. A fence post held, a ledger balanced, a horse approached on its own terms, a man who said "we" without attaching a price to it. She could not have said exactly when it had happened, only that it had, and that it was real, and that real things were different from performed things in ways that mattered. Rowan stood up from the step. He stretched slightly, the way a man did at the end of a long day. He looked at her in the last of the light, with that full attention look that she'd catalogued carefully since the beginning, and there was something in it now. Some particular quality that she hadn't seen in the beginning and that she understood looking at it was something he hadn't been showing her then. Something that had come in slowly with the weeks, like water finding its level. "I'm going to check the cattle," he said. "I'll start dinner," she said. He moved off the porch. She got up from the bench. And they moved in their separate directions through the end of the day with the ease of people who had figured out how to be in the same life without taking up each other's air. And that, she thought, was rarer than most people understood. She was in the kitchen, the fire going in the stove, when she heard him come back in an hour later and hang his coat on the hook and wash his hands at the basin. His footsteps on the floor, easy and familiar. A drawer opened, closed. He was setting the table. She hadn't asked him to. He just did it, the way he did most things, because it needed doing, and he was there. She stood at the stove and cooked dinner in a kitchen that smelled like wood smoke in the coming summer, and outside the cottonwood tree stood at the edge of the yard in the dark, and the night settled over the Texas plain like something that had earned it. And Lydia Hale, she used her own name in her own head now, fully, without the qualifier of it being new, breathed all the way through. It was not a small thing. She knew it was not a small thing. Some things looked like nothing from the outside and were everything from the inside, and this was one of them. She breathed. She cooked. She was here. And the man who had once owned her fear was a long way away, in a city she had left, calculating a risk he was going to decide was too high. She didn't know that yet with certainty. She would not know it for weeks, when the silence from the east stretched long enough to mean something. But she felt it, the way you felt a change in weather before it arrived, in the particular quality of the air and the angle of the light. The worst of it was behind her. She could not have proven that yet. But she knew it the way she knew the tomatoes were tomatoes, because she'd planted them herself, tended them carefully, and she knew what she'd put in the ground. The silence from Philadelphia arrived the way Lydia had predicted it would. Not with any announcement, just with the gradual accumulation of days that contained nothing from that direction. A week, 2 weeks, a month. Judge Carver sent word in late July that the federal contact in San Antonio had formally registered the documentation, dated and filed, which meant that any legal action Voss might attempt would now have to contend with a paper trail that predated it. The lawyer in New York confirmed in a short letter that he had received no further inquiries. Edmund Voss, it seemed, had made his calculation and arrived at the expected answer. Lydia read Carver's letter at the kitchen table, set it down, and went back to the butter she'd been churning. She didn't feel triumphant exactly. She felt the way you felt when a storm you'd been tracking for a long time finally changed direction and moved away from you. Not joy so much as the particular relief of a held breath, finally released. She'd been braced for so long that the unbracing took time. The body didn't simply stop vigilance because the mind had decided it was safe. It took weeks before she stopped listening for footsteps on the road, weeks before she slept through full nights without waking at odd hours to lie still and assess the dark. Rowan noticed, though he didn't say much about it, he had a way of making small adjustments that required no commentary, leaving the lamp burning a little longer in the evenings, finding reasons to come in from the barn at the time she seemed least settled, being in whatever room she was in without crowding it. It wasn't performed comfort, it was just presence, offered and not insisted upon, and she accepted it the way she'd slowly learned to accept most of what he offered. Carefully at first, then with less thought, then finally as something she didn't feel the need to account for at all. Summer built itself into something enormous over the Texas plain. The heat came down in waves that shimmered off the flat earth and made everything at a distance look liquid and uncertain. The cattle drank twice as much and moved less. The kitchen garden needed water every day, and the tomatoes, hers, and proven to be tomatoes to everyone's eventual satisfaction, came in red and plentiful and tasted the way things tasted when you'd put work into them. Pete DeLacy turned 21 in August and celebrated this milestone by falling off a horse. He'd bet Lydia he could ride bareback, losing the bet and acknowledging the loss with the dignity appropriate to the occasion, which was to say very little. "I had the first part," he said, sitting in the dirt. "You had about 4 seconds of the first part," she said. "That's more than I usually get with that horse." She helped him up. He was fine, bruised shoulder, bruised pride. He grinned at her with that relentless cheerfulness that had worn her down so thoroughly she no longer even tried to resist it, and she shook her head and went back to what she'd been doing, and she was smiling before she'd gone 3 steps, which she considered a reasonable trade for the ongoing trial of Pete's optimism about his own equestrian abilities. The ranch itself was doing better. The grazing rotation she'd proposed in the aftermath of the May storm had worked as she'd calculated. The remaining cattle came to market weight better than the previous year, and the numbers in the ledger at the end of August were, while not abundant, solidly in the range that meant they were building rather than merely maintaining. She and Rowan sat with the ledger on evenings after dinner sometimes, not with any urgency, but with the particular shared attention of people who had put their weight behind the same thing and were watching it hold. "If the fall prices come in where Calhoun thinks they will," she said one evening in September, running her finger down a column, "we can put the North well back in order before winter and still have enough left to buy the additional stock we talked about in spring." "That's if Calhoun's right," Rowan said. "Calhoun's been calling fall cattle prices in this county for 20 years, she said. "He's been wrong twice." "In 20 years? I'm just noting the margin for error." She looked at him sideways. "You're cautious." "I'm a rancher in Texas," he said. "If I wasn't cautious, I'd be broke or dead." "Both of those things can be true," she said. "Calhoun's still right about the prices." He made a sound that was not agreement and was not disagreement, which she had cataloged as his version of, "You're probably right, and I'm not going to make a performance of admitting it," and which she had come to find oddly endearing, which was information about herself that she was still adjusting to. She was adjusting to a lot of things. The way she'd begun waking up in the morning without the immediate calculation of threat that had been her first conscious act for 4 years. The way she'd started leaving tools in the yard without bringing them in, because this was her yard, and the tools were hers, and nothing required them to be secured. The way she'd started, sometime in August, thinking of the ranch not as the place she'd come to, but as the place she lived. A distinction that was small to describe and large to feel. She noticed it first with the cottonwood tree. She'd stopped seeing it as a landmark, a reference point against which she measured distance and direction. She'd started seeing it the way you saw something you'd looked at so many times it had become part of your internal landscape, not noted, just known. She'd planted things in its shade. She'd sat under it in the evenings with her coffee when the porch was too hot. She'd watched Pete fall out of it once, for reasons that he'd explained at length and that still didn't fully make sense, but which had resulted in no serious injury and a story that got told at the Holt's dinner table twice. It was her tree. Not by deed. The deed was Rowan's. But in the way that things become yours through the daily accumulation of living alongside them. She was thinking about none of this on the morning the fire started. She was thinking about the north fence inspection she'd planned and whether the sky's color meant rain before noon. The smoke came from the southwest first, which was the wrong direction for anyone's controlled burn. Nobody in the community did controlled burns in September, when the grass was at its driest and the wind was at its most unpredictable. Pete saw it first from the East Ridge, where he'd gone to check on a section of fence, and came back hard enough that his horse was lathered. "Prairie fire," he said, before he'd fully stopped. "Southwest. Maybe 6 miles. Moving fast." Rowan was already moving before Pete had finished the sentence. He didn't run. Running was for when there was nowhere to go, and you had to cover distance in a hurry, and right now there were things to do that required steadiness. But he moved with the concentrated speed of someone who had categorized the situation and was operating on the outcome of that categorization. How wide? He said to Pete. Couldn't tell from the ridge. The smoke's broad. Wind's coming from the west. Pete looked at the sky. It shifts. We're telegraph in town, Rowan said. He turned to Lydia. He looked at her directly and without softening it. It's bad. The wind is wrong. If it holds west, it'll push it across the Calhoun spread and then toward us. If it shifts north... He didn't finish that sentence. He didn't need to. Lydia looked at the smoke on the southwest horizon. It was the yellowish gray of grass fire, not the darker color of something structural, wide, the way Pete had said, moving. What do we do? She said. Fire break, he said. North line of the property, where it borders the Holt Range. We plow it now, deep as we can, wide as we can. It won't stop a fully moving fire, but it'll slow it and give it somewhere to lose energy. He looked at her steadily. I need you to ride to the Holts and to Calhoun. Tell them what's coming. Tell them to start their own brakes on their south and east lines. The more brakes we cut before it gets here, the better everyone's odds. And the cattle? Pete drives them north toward the creek. Water won't burn. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, the first time he'd touched her with that kind of directness, quick and firm and completely without calculation. Ride hard. She rode hard. Margaret Holt was in her yard when Lydia came up, and Margaret read her face and the lathered horse before a word was spoken. How far? Margaret said. 6 miles when Pete saw it. That was 15 minutes ago. Margaret was already shouting for her nephews before Lydia had finished the sentence. The Holt spread mobilized with a speed that told you this wasn't the first time they'd faced this particular terror. Prairie fires were a fact of life out here, something everyone feared and everyone had some plan for. Though the plans varied in quality and the fires varied in cooperation with those plans. Calhoun's place was 2 miles south, which meant 2 miles closer to the smoke, and when Lydia rode up to his gate, the smoke was visibly thicker on the southern horizon, and she could smell it now, the dry, mean smell of burning grass. Calhoun was already hitching his plow horse. Saw it from the upper field, he said, without looking up from the traces. My south line? And east, Lydia said. The wind's west. I know what the wind is, he said. He looked up then, sharp eyes taking her in. Rowan's cutting his north line. Starting now. Tell him to angle it, Calhoun said. Straight east-west breaks are a start, but angled cuts take the energy out better. 30 degrees off the wind line. He looked at her to see if she was tracking it. She was. He nodded once, the acknowledgement of a man who didn't waste words on repetition, and went back to his traces. She rode back. She relayed Calhoun's instruction. Rowan had the plow out already, the big draft horse working, Pete driving the cattle north in a wide, determined arc. She took the relay message to the telegraph office in town, a hard ride, 12 minutes each way, lungs full of smoke-tinted air by the time she got back. And then she came back to the north line and took the second plow handle, because there was a second plow and someone needed to run it. Rowan looked at her when she came up beside him. She was out of breath and her hair had come completely undone, and her hands were not entirely steady from the hard riding. You don't have to, he started. I know I don't have to, she said. Give me the line. He gave her the line. They worked for 3 hours. The work was brutal in the September heat, the kind that lived in your shoulders and your lower back and your hands, and then spread outward from there until your whole body was simply one continuous condition of effort. The smoke thickened as the morning wore on and the fire moved, and there were moments when the wind shifted and the smoke dropped low over the field they were working in, and she couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. And she kept her head down and her hands on the handles and followed the line she'd committed to, because stopping was not useful. Margaret arrived at mid-morning with her nephews and 2 additional hands she'd borrowed from a neighboring operation 3 miles north, and they brought shovels and wet sacks and the grim organized energy of people who had come to work and not to watch. Margaret herself worked the line without complaint and without looking up, and Lydia, glancing sideways at her through the smoke, felt something that was close to love. Not the kind you built over years, but the kind that arrived fully formed in a crisis, when someone showed you exactly who they were, and it was everything you needed it to be. The fire crested the southern ridge at noon. She saw it from the brake line, the actual orange line of it, a mile wide and moving, the heat preceding it in visible waves. The grass in front of it went from green dry to brown to flame in what looked like seconds, and the sound of it was something she hadn't been prepared for. a dry, rushing roar that wasn't loud so much as constant, the sound of something with its own momentum. "Brake's not wide enough," Pete shouted from somewhere to her left. He was back from driving the cattle, face black with smoke. "South end, it's not wide enough." Rowan made a decision in about 2 seconds. "South end, everyone south, we widen it now. If it gets to the dry grass on the near side of the brake, without the brake being wide enough, we lose the ability to stop it at all." "The fire's a mile," Pete started. "I know how far the fire is," Rowan said. "Move." They moved south. She moved with them. The heat was perceptible now, physical, pressing against the front of her like an open oven door. She worked the plow while Rowan and Margaret's nephews worked shovels behind it, widening the already turned earth, clearing anything burnable, and the fire came on with a patience that felt almost deliberate. The patience of something that had all the fuel it needed and no reason to hurry. They got it wide enough. She would never be entirely sure by how much. The fire hit the brake line at the south end at approximately 1 in the afternoon, found insufficient fuel to maintain its momentum, and began to lose coherence at the edges. The middle still pushing north, but the flanks dying back as they ran out of continuous grass to carry them. A section on the Calhoun side got through and burned a 1/4 mile of his east pasture, before Calhoun and his hands beat it down with wet sacks, but the ranches held. The Holt property held. The break Lydia and Rowan had started at dawn held along its entire length. By 4 in the afternoon, the worst of it had passed them, angling north and east where it would eventually reach the flatter open country and burn itself out over a day or two. The sky was orange and gray for miles in every direction, and the air tasted like ash, and everyone who had worked the brake line was filthy and exhausted in a specific physical way that sat differently than regular tiredness, heavier, more settled. Like the work was still in your muscles and your muscles hadn't decided whether to believe it was over. Lydia sat down in the turned earth of the brake line. She didn't plan to. Her legs made the decision, and she went with it. The soil was warm beneath her and smelled like turned ground and distant burning, and she put her hands flat on it and breathed. Rowan sat down beside her. He was as filthy as she was. Ash on his face, hands black, the back of his coat singed along one shoulder in a way that she'd address when they were home. He sat close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, which was closer than he usually sat, and he didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't move away. Pete came and stood a few feet away and looked at the smoke on the horizon for a long moment. "Well," he said, "I thought we were going to lose it." "We almost did," Rowan said. "At the south end," Pete said. "If we hadn't widened." He looked at Lydia. "That was your plow that widened it." "It was everyone's plow," she said. "It was your plow," Pete said, with the simple accuracy of someone who had been there and paid attention. "You ran it the last 20 minutes on that section. I was watching. The rest of us were on shovels." She looked at the brake line, the wide, dark stripe of turned earth that had been for approximately 2 hours. The difference between the ranch surviving and the ranch not surviving. She had planted things in this ground. She had fixed this ground's fences, learned this ground's water, understood this ground's seasons. She had given this ground her work and her days and whatever it was she had instead of peace, and the ground had held. "It held," she said, which was the only thing that needed saying. "Yeah." The community came to them the next day. Not organized, not planned, they just came. Calhoun first before breakfast to assess the damage on the shared boundary and to say, in his particular spare way, that the break had saved his east pasture and probably his barn. Then the Holts, who brought food because Margaret Holt's response to crisis was always food and always in quantity. Then 3 other families from within riding distance, some of whom Lydia had met only once or twice, drawn by the same combination of practical assessment and something harder to name. They walked the burn line. They walked the break. They looked at the places where the fire had come closest and the places where it had held. Several of the men examined the angled sections of the break, Calhoun's instruction, which Lydia had relayed and Rowan had implemented, with the professional attention of people who had just watched something work and wanted to understand why. "You ran the south section," a man named Birch said to Lydia, not as a question. Birch had a spread 4 miles east and a reputation for being precise about attribution. "Those last 20 minutes." "Yes," she said. He nodded. He had the face of a man who didn't give assessments casually. "Good work," he said, and moved on. It was 2 words. But out here, from Birch, those 2 words were the equivalent of a speech. Margaret sat with Lydia on the porch while the men walked the line. She had her coffee, Lydia had hers, and the air still smelled faintly of ash, but the sky had cleared, and the day was coming in clean. "You know what just happened?" Margaret said. "The fire," Lydia said. "Not the fire." Margaret looked at her with the direct green eyes. "The fire was the occasion. What just happened is that everyone out here saw you work." She paused. "Birch doesn't say good work to people who don't deserve it. He didn't say it to his own son-in-law until the 3rd year." 2 words, Lydia said. "2 words from Birch is a character reference," Margaret said. "Out here, that matters more than you probably understand yet." She looked at the people walking the property. Her nephews, Calhoun, Birch, 2 women she knew from the church in town who had come out to help and had ended up staying for the full accounting. "You came out here as Rowan's wife," Margaret said. "You're leaving that fire as yourself." Lydia looked out at the property. Her property, hers and Rowan's, by deed and by the investment of her work and her judgment and her days. The cottonwood tree at the east edge of the yard had a dusting of ash on its leaves, but it was standing, root deep and entirely unmoved by the excitement of the last 24 hours. "I don't know what I thought I was coming out here to be," she said, honestly. "I had a plan that was mostly about surviving, about getting far enough away that I could breathe." "And now?" Margaret said. Lydia thought about it carefully, the way she thought about things that deserved careful thought. "Now I'm here," she said. "Not surviving here. Just here. This is the place I live. These are the people I know." She looked at her hands, which still had ground-in ash in the creases. "I didn't come here to build anything. I came here to escape. But I built something anyway, without noticing I was doing it." "That's how it usually goes," Margaret said. She didn't elaborate, which was right. Some things didn't need elaboration. That evening, when the visitors had gone and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse and the property was quiet, Lydia walked the brake line alone. Not to inspect it. The inspection was done. She just walked it, the way you walked through something significant to make it real in your body, to make the memory of it physical. The turned earth was dark in the evening light. On the south side, the burn, scorched grass, and the ghost smell of it. On the north side, the ranch, the pasture, the cattle. Pete had driven back from the creek, the barn, the house, the cottonwood tree at the edge of the yard. She stood at the brake line and looked from one side to the other, what had burned and what had held. She heard Rowan's boots on the grass behind her. He came and stood beside her and looked at the same thing she was looking at. "Pete counted the herd twice," he said. "No losses." "The garden's fine," she said. "The west side caught some ash, but nothing burned." "The north well has sediment from the cattle pressing around it," he said. "Need to clear it." "I know," she said. "Tomorrow." They stood. The air was cooling fast the way fall air did on the plain when the sun went down, pulling the heat out of the day like something being reclaimed. She could see the stars beginning in the east, and the cottonwood tree was a dark shape against the last of the light. "You could have stayed back," he said. "When I said to ride to the Holtz, you could have kept going, made sure you were clear." "I know," she said. "But you came back." "It's my ranch," she said. It came out simple and flat and entirely accurate. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Yeah," he said. "It is." She looked at him. In the fading light, his face was tired, genuinely tired, the deep kind that came after sustained effort. And there was a streak of ash along his jaw that she'd told herself she was going to mention and kept not mentioning. He looked worn and solid and real. And she thought about the curtains, and the 43 words, and the fence post, and the ledger, and every small thing that had accumulated into this particular evening, standing at this particular line in the earth. She thought about what Margaret had said. "You came out here as Rowan's wife. You're leaving that fire as yourself." She rolled that around and thought it wasn't quite complete. She'd come out here as no one's anything. She'd come out here as someone fleeing, which was a kind of negative space, a definition by absence. And she'd become, over months, through the small accretion of daily work and daily difficulty, Someone defined by what she was rather than what she was running from. She was Lydia Hale. She kept accounts and planted gardens and ran plow lines in the face of prairie fires and said what she thought to people who needed to hear it. She had a horse she'd learned to read, and a ranch hand she'd stopped finding irritating, and a neighbor who had her coffee cup in her kitchen. She had a husband who said we without attaching a price to it, and who had hemmed curtains unevenly and hung them anyway, because a bare window felt like it needed addressing. She loved him. She had not said it yet, not even to herself in so many words, because she'd been careful about conclusions, because evidence mattered and she'd needed enough of it. But standing at the brake line in the ash-smelling evening, she said it to herself plainly and found that it was true in the specific way that true things were true. Not exciting or overwhelming, just there, solid, like good fence posts properly set. She didn't say it out loud that evening. She would eventually, in the way things got said when they were ready. Not with ceremony, probably, not with the kind of declaration that required staging, but plainly and directly, the way she said most things. She would know when. "We should go in," she said. "Yeah," he said. He didn't move immediately. He stood looking at the brake line for another moment, at what it had held, at what it meant. Then he looked at her in the way he looked at things he was trying to understand, and she thought he was probably arriving at some of the same territory she'd just arrived at, in his own way, by his own route, with his own particular quality of attention. "Lydia," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then the corner of his mouth moved in that way it had, not quite a smile, the structural suggestion of one, and he turned toward the house. She turned with him. They walked back across the property in the dark, through the ash smell and the cooling air, toward the lit window of the kitchen, which threw a warm rectangle of light out onto the bare earth of the yard. The flour sack curtains were visible through the window. Uneven hemming, pale fabric, moving slightly as the evening air found a gap in the sash. She looked at them as she walked toward the house, and she thought that the things people did because a bare window felt like it needed addressing were sometimes the truest things about them. She thought that she had made a life out of a letter of 43 words and a stranger's distance maintained on a dusty street, and it had become, through her own hands and his, and the daily work of two people pulling in the same direction, something real. She was not finished being afraid of things, probably. She was not finished being difficult or cautious or prone to counting words and letters. She was not a different person than the one who had stepped off the stagecoach in Tallow Creek with a suitcase held shut with a belt. She was the same person, with more ground under her. She pushed open the door. The kitchen was warm and smelled like the last of the supper fire in the stove. She put water on for coffee, because there was always coffee, and Rowan sat down at the table that he'd started setting without being asked some time in the weeks that had accumulated into a life. And outside the cottonwood tree stood in the full dark, enormous and rooted and patient, the way it had always been, waiting for the people underneath it to figure out what they were building. They were building it, slowly, imperfectly, without announcement. But they were building it, and the foundation was solid, and that was what mattered about any structure worth the wood it took to raise it. The letter from the New York lawyer arrived in October, 6 weeks after the fire, on a Tuesday that had started like any other. Lydia at the stove before dawn, Rowan in the barn, Pete somewhere between the two doing something that probably involved more optimism than skill. The letter was thin, 1 page, formal language, but the substance of it was simple enough. Edmund Voss had withdrawn all legal inquiries pertaining to Lydia Ashcroft, formerly of Philadelphia. The lawyer had received written confirmation from Voss's own counsel that no further action would be pursued. The sealed documentation would remain in the lawyer's keeping indefinitely, as agreed insurance against any future reconsideration, but based on the firmness of the withdrawal language, the lawyer considered it unlikely to be needed. She read it at the kitchen table. Then she read it again. Then she folded it carefully and set it on the table and sat with it for a while. The way you sat with something you'd been carrying for a long time after you'd finally been able to put it down, adjusting to the absence of the weight, which was its own strange condition. Rowan came in from the barn at the usual time, looked at her face, and looked at the letter. "Voss," she said. He came and sat down. She slid the letter across. He read it, and his face did the thing where it went still, but this was a different kind of still from the kind she'd catalogued before. Not the stillness of contained anger or managed tension, but the stillness of a man absorbing something that had resolved. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. He set the letter down between them on the table. Outside, the fall morning was coming in cold and clear, and the cottonwood tree at the east edge of the yard had gone yellow, the way it went every October, each leaf catching the early light like it had something to say about it. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it. She gave all her important questions the time they deserved. "Like I've been fighting something in a dark room for so long, I forgot what it was like to just stand somewhere with the lights on," she said. "Not happy exactly, not relieved exactly, just clear." She paused. "I didn't realize how much space it was taking up until it stopped taking up space." Rowan nodded slowly. "He made the calculation," she said. "I knew he would. Men like Voss always do. They don't stop because they've changed. They stop because the cost exceeds the value. That's all this is." "Does that bother you?" he said. "That it's just arithmetic for him?" She considered that honestly. "A little," she said. "But I've been free either way since the day Grisham rode out of that yard. Whether Voss made peace with it or not, I'd already decided what my life was going to look like." She looked at the letter. "This just means I don't have to keep one eye on the road." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His hand was warm and calloused and entirely present, and she turned her hand under his so their palms were together. And they sat like that for a while in the quiet kitchen while the cottonwood tree caught the morning light outside, and Pete could be heard somewhere in the yard, talking to one of the horses in the tone of someone who genuinely believed the horse was following the conversation. She said it then. Not because the moment was perfect. It wasn't perfect. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning with ash still in the seams of the kitchen floor from the fire 6 weeks ago, an amended coat hanging on the hook by the door, and a letter about the worst 4 years of her life sitting on the table between them. She said it because it was true, and she'd decided that true things deserved to be said plainly. "I love you," she said. He looked at her, that full attention look, steady and without performance. "I know," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "I've known for a while," he said. "I was waiting for you to know. That's—" She stopped, thought about it. "That's either very patient or very presumptuous." "Probably both," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. "Do you have something to say in return, or are you just going to sit there being satisfied with yourself?" "I love you," he said, simply, directly, the way he said things that were simply true. She looked at him across the table. This man she'd come to on 43 words and stayed with because of everything that came after, this quiet, stubborn, attentive, imperfect man who hemmed curtains badly and set tables without being asked and kept his opinions to himself until he'd thought them through and then stated them without hedging. And she felt what she'd felt at the break line 6 weeks ago, solid and unceremonious and entirely real. "Good," she said. "Now let's eat breakfast. Pete's going to eat everything if we don't get out there." "Pete always eats everything," Rowan said, standing. "I know," she said, "and yet we keep feeding him." "He's useful," Rowan said. "He is," she said. "Occasionally." The years that came after were not easy ones in the sense that they were smooth and without trouble, because nothing real is. They were easy in a different sense, the sense of two people who had learned how to carry weight together, so that the weight itself didn't change, but the carrying of it became something you didn't think about every moment, the way you stopped thinking about your own breathing once you'd learned to breathe right. The ranch grew, not explosively, not in the way of frontier myths where a man turns hardscrabble into empire by sheer force of character. It grew the way actual ranches grew. One good season, one hard one, a decision that paid off, another that didn't quite, an expansion that worked and one that had to be scaled back. The whole imperfect process of building something in terrain that didn't make concessions. She kept the accounts. This was never formally decided. It had simply become hers the way the kitchen garden had become hers, through the investment of attention and competence, and Rowan never revisited it except to ask questions that demonstrated he was paying attention and trusted her to know what she was talking about. She was good at it. She was better than good. She had a sense for risk and return that was partly learned and partly something she'd always had, a native ability to see the shape of a problem and find the point of leverage in it. In the spring following the fire, she expanded the garden substantially. Not just vegetables, but a section she gave to herbs, another to flowers that she grew, not for sentiment, but because she'd read that certain varieties brought in the right insects for pollination, and she was, if nothing else, a practical person. The tomatoes came back better than the year before, which she mentioned to Rowan with the careful neutrality of someone who wasn't making a point and absolutely was making a point. "You were right about the tomatoes," he said, which had become, between them, a phrase that carried more than its literal meaning. It meant, "I acknowledge that I underestimated something. It was a temporary condition. I've corrected it." "I'm usually right about the tomatoes," she said, which meant, "I know. You're forgiven. Let's move on." Pete DeLacy left in the winter of their second year. Not badly, not with any hard feeling, but because his father had taken ill back in Galveston and he was needed there. He stood in the yard on a cold January morning with his horse packed and his bedroll tied and looked at the two of them with an expression that he clearly hadn't had time to prepare a better version of. "I'm going to miss this place," he said. "I didn't expect to. I thought it'd be a stop." "It was a good stop," Lydia said. "Mrs. Hale." He looked at her with his relentless honesty. "You're the best rancher I've worked for, including him." He jerked his chin at Rowan. "Don't tell him I said that." "He's standing right there," she said. "I know," Pete said. He mounted his horse, looked down at them. "The horses will miss you too, even Mrs. Pemberton." "Mrs. Pemberton will miss the attention," Lydia said. "She'll get over it." He laughed. He rode. She watched him until the road bent and he was gone, and she felt the particular sadness of someone leaving who had been genuinely good company, which was different from the sadness of loss, more like the sadness of completion, of something that had run its natural course. They hired a hand named Cal Reyes the following spring, a methodical man of 30 who did his work without drama and ate dinner with them on Tuesdays and Fridays and otherwise kept to himself, which suited everyone well enough. The first time Lydia was asked to speak at the community meeting in Tallow Creek, she thought it was a mistake. The meeting was about water rights, the proposed diversion of a creek tributary that would benefit the larger landholders in the eastern county at the expense of the smaller operations in the west. And Calhoun had called a meeting because Calhoun was a man who believed that organized objection was more effective than individual complaint. Lydia had come with Rowan, intending to listen, and had found herself standing up before she'd fully decided to. She talked for 8 minutes. She had the numbers. She'd been doing the research since she'd first read the proposal that Judge Carver had circulated 3 weeks earlier. She talked about the downstream impact on the creek that ran along Rowan's northern boundary. She talked about the legal precedent Carver himself had cited in a water dispute 5 years earlier. She talked about what the cost would be to the smaller spreads in terms they could calculate against their own ledgers, because she'd done those calculations and they were sitting in her coat pocket. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Calhoun said, "That's the argument," and moved to discuss it, and the meeting went on for another 2 hours and produced a petition to the county that Lydia ended up drafting because she was the one who'd done the research, and it seemed efficient. The diversion was blocked. It took 4 months and 2 hearings, but it was blocked. Imoriting. Birch found her after the second hearing and said, "You should think about the county commission." He said it the way he said things, flatly, without preamble. She looked at him. "I'm a rancher." "You're a rancher who just argued water law in front of a county judge," he said. "The commission needs people who can do that and also understand what it costs when a water table shifts." He walked away, which was Birch's version of leaving space for consideration. She thought about it. She thought about it for weeks, turning it over the way she turned things that were new to her, looking for the edges, measuring the shape. She told Rowan one evening. He looked at her. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Then think about it more," he said, with the cheerful simplicity of a man who believed that most problems could be addressed once you decided what you wanted. "What's stopping you from trying?" She thought about it. "Nothing," she said. The word landed strangely. She wasn't used to it as an answer to that question. Nothing was stopping her. It was almost a novel condition. "Then try," he said. "Worst case, you lose. You've survived worse." She was elected to the county commission 3 years after the fire. She won by a margin that surprised everyone except Birch and Margaret, both of whom had apparently been working toward this outcome through channels she hadn't fully tracked. She served 2 terms, and in those 2 terms she concerned herself primarily with water access, land documentation disputes, and the question of what protections existed for women who arrived in frontier communities in arrangements that didn't serve their interests, protections that were sparse and inconsistently applied, and that she spent a considerable amount of time working to make slightly less sparse. She didn't fix it. She wasn't naive enough to think she fixed it. But she pushed at the edges of what was possible, consistently and without making noise about it. And things shifted incrementally in the direction she was pushing, and some women who came after her arrived into a county that had slightly more standing for them than it had before. That mattered. It was not everything, and it was not nothing. Their first child was born 4 years after their wedding, on a February morning so cold the water in the wash basin had iced overnight. They named her Ruth, which had been Rowan's mother's name, and she came into the world arguing, which Lydia privately considered appropriate and which Rowan received with the expression of a man confronting something considerably more intense than anything he'd prepared for. "She's fine," the midwife said, with the brisk authority of someone who had seen a great many arrivals and understood that the people present always needed to hear that first. "She's loud," Rowan said. "She's healthy," Lydia corrected, from a position that required more effort than she intended to let on. "There's a difference." Ruth was, in fact, loud and healthy and definite from the first week, in ways that accumulated into a personality over the months of her first year that Lydia recognized with a clarity that was sometimes startling. The child had opinions about things she couldn't yet articulate and communicated them with the focused determination of someone who found the available vocabulary inadequate to the strength of her views. "She's like you," Rowan said once, watching Ruth refuse, with extreme prejudice, a bowl of something she'd decided she didn't want. "She's her own," Lydia said. "Don't put her in a box." "I'm putting her in a box that says knows what she thinks," he said. "It's a good box." Their second child, a boy they named Thomas, arrived 3 years after Ruth. Easier in some ways, more confounding in others. Thomas was quiet where Ruth was not, watchful where Ruth was active, and had his father's quality of stillness, which Lydia recognized and valued and also found, occasionally, deeply inconvenient when she needed to know what he was thinking, and he had decided to think it privately. Ruth and Thomas grew up under the cottonwood tree. This was not metaphorical. They genuinely grew up under it, because the tree had the widest shade in the yard and the best branch configuration for the kind of climbing that children will engage in regardless of how many times they're told about the distance to the ground. Lydia told them once each and then stopped telling them, because the second time was redundant and the third would have been purely for her own comfort, and she preferred honesty about her motivations. She watched them climb and thought about the version of herself that had sat in the stagecoach 3 weeks into a journey toward a stranger's door, trying to calculate risk from inadequate information. That woman had not imagined this, not because she'd lacked imagination, but because she'd only been able to imagine forward from the life she was in. And the life she was in hadn't contained a cottonwood tree, or a man who set tables without being asked, or 2 children who argued about everything with the specific intensity of people who had been raised to believe their own opinions mattered. She'd built this. She hadn't built it alone. She was clear about that, clear in the way of someone who understood that the romantic notion of the solitary self-made life was mostly useful for people who'd never actually built anything and didn't know how much of it depended on other hands. She'd built it with Rowan and with the community that had stood shoulder to shoulder on a porch in June and behind a plow line in September. She'd built it with Margaret's coffee and Calhoun's instruction and Birch's 2 words and Pete's relentless cheerfulness and Cal Rhea's steady, methodical presence and a judge who rode out to a ranch himself because he believed the situation warranted it. And she'd built it in a specific and foundational way out of the raw material of the worst years of her life, which was not something she would have chosen. You didn't choose which material you got to build with. You worked with what you had. The news of Edmund Voss's death reached her 12 years after she'd left Philadelphia, in a brief notice forwarded by the New York lawyer with a short professional note explaining that the documentation in his keeping was now effectively moot, but that he would retain it as long as she wished, at no charge, as a matter of completed professional duty. Voss had died of a stroke in his study. He was 63. His shipping company had been under federal investigation for 2 years prior, not for the Charleston matter, which had never needed to be formally deployed, but for a separate series of transactions that had attracted the attention of customs agents independently. The investigation had reportedly cost him considerably. She read the notice once. She set it down. She felt not satisfaction exactly, not grief. Something more complicated and less clean than either of those. She felt the particular weight of years and the specific texture of time spent afraid, and the distance between that and where she was standing in the kitchen of a ranch house in Texas with 2 children making noise in the yard and a husband who would be in for lunch in an hour. She felt that the story was over. Not just her part of it, the whole thing. The thing that had started when her uncle had made a transaction out of her, and that she had eventually, through stubbornness and evidence and the help of people who chose to help her, walked away from. She took the notice to the fireplace and burned it, because some things didn't need to be kept. The sealed letter in New York she instructed the lawyer to destroy as well, because it had been built as a weapon, and she was done needing weapons. Then she went out into the yard where Ruth was attempting to explain something to Thomas, with the emphatic particularity of an 8-year-old who knows she's right and can't understand why the person she's talking to doesn't immediately concede. And Thomas was listening with his father's quality of attention and his father's quality of not yet responding. And the cottonwood tree was coming into leaf because it was May, and the tree did this every May without requiring anything from anyone. She sat on the porch and watched her children and breathed the spring air. Chin. Rowan's hair went gray at the temples first, then gradually throughout, over the years in the slow way that made it hard to pinpoint when it had happened. He remained lean and deliberate and possessed of opinions he held until proven wrong and released without drama once he was, and he kept setting the table without being asked, and he kept consulting her on everything that mattered, and he was still, at the core, the man who had kept 3 feet of distance on a dusty street and offered choices where other men would have made demands. He was not a simple man, and living with him was not a simple business. They had arguments that lasted days sometimes, real ones, not performances, about things that mattered to both of them: money, the children, the direction of the ranch, what to do about a particular situation in the community that they saw from different angles. She was not an easy person to be married to, and she knew it, and he was stubborn in ways that tried her patience thoroughly. And they were both people who had strong views and were not naturally inclined toward easy surrender. But they fought honestly, and they resolved things honestly, and neither of them used the other's history against them, and neither of them mistook volume for strength or silence for agreement. And when it was over, and they moved forward from where they'd landed, which was sometimes where she'd started, and sometimes where he'd started, and sometimes somewhere neither of them had been at the beginning. That was marriage, she'd come to understand. Not the achievement of harmony. Harmony was static, and real things moved. It was the willingness to keep arriving at each other across whatever distance the latest argument or season or year had introduced. The willingness to keep showing up to the same table. He was sitting at that table one evening in the fall of their 20th year, doing the accounts she'd taught him to understand well enough to check, because she believed in people understanding the things they relied on. And Ruth, 20 years old now, with her mother's directness and her own particular brand of it, was sitting across from him arguing about the grazing plan with the specific energy of someone who'd grown up watching 2 people who took arguments seriously and had concluded it was a normal mode of operation. Lydia was at the stove. She listened to them go back and forth, Ruth quick and assured, Rowan measured, asking the questions that showed he was taking her seriously rather than managing her. And she thought, this is what I built. Not the ranch, not the accounts, not the county commission seats. This kitchen, this argument, this specific ordinary evening where a young woman argued with her father about grazing as though her opinion mattered, because it had never occurred to her that it might not, because she'd been raised in a house where that was the default. That was the thing Lydia had never had and had eventually found, and that she'd been, perhaps without fully knowing it, building into the ground-level assumption of her daughter's life. Not safety, exactly. Safety wasn't a thing you could guarantee. Not happiness, which came and went. The assumption that your opinion mattered, that your choices were yours, that no one's claim over you superseded your own. It was a small thing to give a child. It was also enormous. She knew both of those things at the same time. You're right about the south pasture, Rowan said to Ruth after a pause that had gone on long enough for his assessment to be complete. Ruth looked vindicated. I know I'm right. You could have a little more grace in the receiving of it, he said. I could, Ruth agreed, but then you wouldn't know I'd heard it. Lydia turned from the stove. She has a point. Rowan looked at her. I know she has a point. She always has a point. That's the problem. It's not a problem, Lydia said. It's a feature. He made the sound that wasn't agreement and wasn't disagreement, and Ruth grinned at her mother across the kitchen, and Lydia grinned back. And something warm moved through the room that wasn't anything you could put in a ledger or argue about at a county meeting. But that was as real as anything else that had happened in this kitchen over 20 years of dailiness. There is a thing that happens to people who survive hard beginnings and go on to build real lives out of them, and it is this. The hard beginning does not disappear. It does not get resolved into something that no longer hurts when pressed. What happens, if you're fortunate and you work at it and you find the right ground to stand on, is that the hard beginning stops being the central fact and becomes one fact among many. It recedes into the larger shape of a life, the way a scar recedes into the skin around it, still there, still yours, but no longer the first thing you see when you look. Lydia knew this not because anyone told her, but because she lived it, over the slow accumulation of years that turned months into decades, in the way time did when you were too busy building something to keep careful track of it. She was 53 the October that Thomas brought his wife home, a woman named Clara, who had come from a town 2 counties east and had a precision about her that Lydia recognized and respected immediately. She watched her son watch Clara across the dinner table and saw in his face the particular quality of attention he had inherited from his father, full, unhurried, directed at the specific person in the room. And she thought about 43 words and a stranger's distance on a dusty street, and she thought that some things passed through families not through telling, but through the daily demonstration of what was possible. After dinner, she and Clara sat on the porch. The cottonwood tree was in its late fall state, mostly bare now, the last leaves catching the evening light. He talks about this place like it's something rare, Clara said, looking at the tree. It is, Lydia said. He talks about you the same way. Lydia looked at her son's wife. He's biased. Probably, Clara said. But he's not wrong. She paused. He told me some of what you came from, before you came here. Lydia was quiet for a moment. She didn't volunteer that story easily or often. It wasn't shame that kept it close, not anymore, but the understanding that it was hers, and it only needed to go where it was useful. It was a long time ago, Lydia said. Does it feel that way? Lydia thought about it honestly. It feels like something that happened to someone who had the same name as me, she said. I can remember it clearly. I don't experience it the same way anymore. She paused. You heal around things. It's not the same as them going away, but you become larger than them if you're lucky, if you do the work. Clara looked at the tree. What was the work? Lydia thought about fence posts and ledgers and plow lines and a county petition and 2 children climbing branches they'd been told once about the distance to the ground. She thought about a man who said we without attaching a cost to it. She thought about choosing every day, in the small ways that didn't announce themselves, to stay in her own life rather than in the life her fear would have built for her if she'd let it. Showing up, she said, every day, to the life you're actually in. Not the one you're afraid of, not the one you used to have, the one in front of you. She looked at Clara. It sounds simple. It isn't, but it's the only thing that actually works. Clara nodded slowly. Then, Thomas said you counted the words in the letter his father sent you before you came. Lydia laughed. 43. Was that enough? To come? Lydia looked at the tree. Old now, enormous, the kind of tree that had become a landmark rather than just a feature. It was enough to try. That was all I needed. Just enough to try. She paused. The rest came from what we did with it once I was here. The door opened behind them, and Rowan came out with 2 cups of coffee, which he handed to them without being asked, because that was simply how he moved through spaces where people needed things. He sat on the step below the bench, the way he'd sat 20 years ago when things were being decided, and looked out at the cottonwood tree in the evening. You're talking about me, he said. It wasn't a question. We're talking about letters, Lydia said. he said, which meant he didn't entirely believe her and was choosing not to make an issue of it. They sat in the cooling evening, the three of them, with coffee and the last of the light and the tree. And inside the house, Thomas and Ruth could be heard in the argument that had apparently been ongoing since before dinner, about something neither of the people on the porch could quite make out, which was probably fine. Lydia held her coffee and looked at the yard. The garden, bare now but ready for spring. The fence that had been replaced 3 times in different sections over 20 years and was solid throughout. The barn that had been expanded twice. The whole accumulated evidence of 2 decades of daily work and daily choosing. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with a suitcase held shut with a leather belt. She thought about what that woman had been carrying. Not just the suitcase, not just the fear, but the specific deprivation of never having been permitted to believe that her own choices were legitimate, that her own life was hers to direct. She thought about what it had taken to learn that. Not a single revelation, not a moment that changed everything at once. It had taken a man who kept 3 feet of distance and said, "Up to you." It had taken a neighbor who showed up on a spotted horse with pickled vegetables and a question she actually wanted answered. It had taken a judge who rode out himself. It had taken a plow line held in the face of a fire. It had taken years of small daily practice, choosing to speak, choosing to stay, choosing to push back and choosing to soften, choosing to build something worth building in the specific imperfect terrain she'd been given. She had not built a perfect life. She would not have known what to do with a perfect life. She had built a real one, which was harder and more durable and considerably more interesting. The thing she most wanted to say, the thing she thought about sometimes when people asked her, as they occasionally did, how she had managed what she'd managed, was this: survival is not the victory. Survival is the beginning. The victory is what you decide to do with yourself once you've survived. Once the crisis has passed and the fear has receded and you're standing in the ordinary morning with your ordinary choices in front of you and no emergency to drive the decision. The victory is choosing. When you don't have to choose from fear anymore, to choose from something else. From curiosity, from love, from the stubborn conviction that the thing you're building matters. From the quiet daily refusal to let the worst thing that ever happened to you be the last word on who you are. That was it. That was the whole of it, as best she could articulate something that lived mostly in the doing rather than the saying. She drank her coffee. Rowan was looking at the tree. Claire had gone quiet in the good way, the way of someone absorbing something rather than waiting to respond. Inside, Thomas and Ruth had apparently resolved their argument, because the particular quality of the noise had changed from combative to companionable. "Cold tonight," Rowan said. "It is," Lydia said. "Garden's covered?" "This morning," she said. He nodded, looked at the tree. The last of the light was going from the sky, and the cottonwood was just a shape now, dark and vast and entirely itself, the way it had been on her first evening here and every evening since. "Good," he said. She reached down and put her hand briefly on his shoulder, the kind of touch that didn't need to announce itself, that lived in the same register as setting the table and answering a question honestly and showing up at the right time without being called. He put his hand over hers for a moment, and then they were both just looking at the tree again, and the evening settled around them the way evenings did when you'd earned them. Some stories end with the enemy defeated, the danger past, the account settled, and the ledger clean. This one ended here, on a porch in the Texas fall, with coffee and an old tree and the sound of grown children inside a house that had been built up from 43 words and a stranger's good faith and 20 years of choosing to stay. Not clean, not simple, but whole. And that, in the end, was the only kind of ending worth working toward. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something that had outlasted it. The cottonwood tree stood. It would stand after all of them were gone, rooted in the ground where a frightened woman had once arrived and decided, against considerable evidence, that it was a reasonable thing to do, to try. It had been enough. It had always been exactly enough.